Buenos días y bienvenidos al 10º Seminario Intercongresos Metrología y Salud, un binomio de garantía para la calidad de vida. Este seminario se realiza en el marco del Día Mundial de la Metrología. Como saben, esta fecha conmemora la firma de la Convención del Metro en el año 1875. Mi nombre es David Martín y seré el moderador de este evento. El seminario tendrá una duración aproximada de 4 horas y se ha organizado de la siguiente forma. Habrá 9 presentaciones de expertos y profesionales de la metrología y de la salud. Cada uno de ellos dispondrá de un máximo de 18 minutos para hacer sus presentaciones. No obstante, las primeras 2 presentaciones tendrán una duración de 28 minutos. Es importante que nos ajustemos al horario previsto, ya que, debido a la variedad de temas a tratar, habrá asistentes interesados en ponencias específicas. A las 12:30 hay prevista una pausa. En cualquier caso, a las 12:45 se reiniciará el seminario con la siguiente presentación. Una vez terminadas todas las presentaciones, hemos reservado un tiempo para preguntas y respuestas. Si desea hacer alguna pregunta, deberá enviarla al correo electrónico webinar@cem.es. Le ruego nos indiquen su nombre y el de la organización a la que pertenecen, así como el del ponente al que quieren dirigir su pregunta. Pueden hacer sus preguntas en inglés o español. Una de mis colegas, Peña, estará revisando el correo y seleccionará las más representativas. El resto de preguntas serán enviadas a los ponentes, por si ellos, tras el seminario, desean responderlas en privado. Señalarles que a este seminario se han inscrito más de 300 personas. Good evening and welcome to the 10th Intercongress Workshop, Metrology and Health and Binomial Warrant for Life Quality, organized by the Centro Español de Metrología in the frame of the World Metrology Day. As you are aware of, this day commemorates the day the Metro Convention was signed in 1875. My name is David Martin, and I will be your host this morning. This event will last around 4 hours and will be organized as follows. There will be 9 presentations delivered by well-known specialists. We have instructed the speakers that their presentation should last a maximum of 18 minutes each, except for the first 2 presentations that will last 28 minutes each. It's really important to remain within this time frame, since all presentations have been timed and attendance may connect just for one specific presentation. At 12:30, there will be a pause. In any case, at 12:45, we will return with the next presentation in order to keep on track. Once all presentations have been delivered, we have reserved enough time for questions and answers. If you have any questions, please send it to webinar@cem.es. If possible, please indicate your name, the name of the institution you belong to, and the speaker you want to address your question to. You may submit your questions in Spanish or English at your will. They will be translated if needed. One of my colleagues, Peña, will be managing the email, reading your questions and selecting the most representative ones to be asked to our speakers. The rest will be sent privately to them who may choose to answer them by email. We are pleased to announce that more than 300 people registered. Finally, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Raúl Blanco, President of CEM and General Secretary for Industry and Small and Medium-Sized Enterprise at the Spanish Ministry of Industry, Commerce and Tourism. He will deliver the opening address. Finalmente, me gustaría dar la palabra a don Raúl Blanco, presidente del CEM y secretario general de Industria y la Pequeña y Mediana Empresa del Ministerio de Industria, Comercio y Turismo, quien dirigirá unas breves palabras de apertura e inaugurará oficialmente este seminario. Presidente Blanco, tiene usted la palabra.
Muchísimas gracias, David. Un placer estar aquí acompañándoos y celebrando este Día Mundial de la Metrología. Siempre lo celebramos aquí presencialmente en el CEM. Este año pues vuelve a no ser posible, tampoco a causa de la pandemia. Esperemos que el año que viene sí que sea posible. En cualquier caso, es un placer estar con todos ustedes, las 300 personas que hay inscritas, 308 concretamente, siempre hay que ser exacto en el ámbito de la metrología. Así que bienvenidos, bienvenidas, welcome. Thank you to everybody. It's a pleasure for us to have you here today and to share our time with you, to talk about metrology and also to transmit the relevance of metrology in our life and in our economy, in our society. So let's begin this Metrology World Day. So I'm going to switch to Spanish again in order to finish my brief introduction. So, estamos en un momento realmente esencial, digamos, y único en nuestras vidas. Hemos vivido un momento tremendamente severo a nivel de salud, tremendamente severo a nivel económico, pero estamos ahora ya saliendo hacia ese escenario de vacunación con toda la prudencia porque la pandemia sigue ahí, saliendo a nivel económico con un plan de recuperación a nivel europeo que es tremendamente relevante en cuanto a su dotación presupuestaria, pero también en cuanto a las actuaciones que define y donde la metrología es importante que esté presente. Para nosotros lo estará en el plan de recuperación, transformación y resiliencia de España. La metrología tendrá un papel relevante con el plan de digitalización y el plan de metrología cuántica que está previsto dentro de ese plan de recuperación, pero también, y en línea con lo que comentaba el presentador, la metrología va mucho más allá y debemos ser capaces de transmitir su importancia y su presencia siempre con ese grado muchas veces de discreción e invisibilidad que hace que no la notemos o que la gente no la perciba, pero que está ahí. Hablamos continuamente ahora del PERTE, del proyecto estratégico de recuperación y transformación económica del vehículo eléctrico, donde queremos tener toda la cadena de valor del vehículo eléctrico, desde el litio, las baterías, la fabricación de vehículo eléctrico, los componentes, la recarga, los puntos de recarga del vehículo eléctrico, y ahí hay metrología, excelentes artículos, tuve ocasión de comentarlo hace muy poco con el director del CEM, excelentes artículos en el ámbito de puntos de recarga se han escrito desde el CEM, también en colaboración con otros centros de metrología internacionales. Otros ámbitos del plan, como es el agroalimentario, nos sitúa ante un elemento común, sea el sector agroalimentario, de industria agroalimentaria que hablemos, sea el cárnico, sea el de frutas y hortalizas, sea el de conservas, hay un elemento común que estamos encontrando, que es, hablando de forma genérica, la digitalización, hablando de forma concreta, la trazabilidad alimentaria, y la trazabilidad alimentaria es metrología. Y ya enlazando con lo que, bueno, otro elemento también que nos encontramos, y ahora justo hace unos minutos lo comentábamos, era en todo el ámbito de comunicación satelital. Se están planteando proyectos en el ámbito de comunicación cuántica y ahí eso es metrología. Y finalmente, ya enlazando con lo que hoy nos ocupa en este Día Mundial de la Metrología y bajo el título de Metrología y Salud, un binomio de garantía para la calidad de vida, justo ayer el presidente del Gobierno anunciaba que después del PERTE del vehículo eléctrico, la voluntad del Gobierno es lanzar un PERTE, un proyecto tractor en el ámbito, se ha definido como salud avanzada, en el ámbito biotecnológico, pero ahí nuevamente, cuando hablamos de medicina personalizada, cuando hablamos de todo lo que es la digitalización de la salud o de la salud digital, ahí eso también es metrología y hoy seguro que tendremos ocasión de verlo a lo largo del seminario. Con lo cual, esa labor de difusión es muy importante. Espero que el seminario de hoy, pues que tratará temas de metrología legal, de cuidado de los pacientes, de determinación a nivel de muestras biológicas en el ámbito de alcohol etílico, abuso de drogas, y después contará también con aspectos metrológicos en los productos sanitarios. Y aquí me voy a permitir saludar y lanzar un abrazo virtual, ya que no nos podemos ver en persona, al equipo de la Agencia Española de Medicamento y Productos Sanitarios. Estará Gloria Hernández, la jefa del organismo notificado, y estará Marcos Timón, el jefe de servicio de productos biológicos. Y yo desde aquí, otro ámbito donde también hay metrología es uno en el que nos ocupa y nos alegra profundamente estos días, como es el de vacunas, y hoy se va a hablar del control de calidad en vacunas COVID y, por tanto, ahí agradecer la maravillosa labor que está realizando la Agencia Española de Medicamento y Producto Sanitario y al mando de su directora, de la doctora Lamas, y de su equipo que estará hoy aquí presente. Por tanto, metrología en nuestras vidas, celebremos este Día Mundial de la Metrología y sigamos luchando por esa visibilidad de la metrología y porque cuente con todos los recursos necesarios tanto en nuestro país como en nuestros países socios y amigos que hoy participan, especialmente desde Latinoamérica, pero también desde otros países europeos. Con lo cual, welcome, thank you very much for your time, and encantados, como siempre, de escucharos y de atenderos desde el Centro Español de Metrología, y esperemos que gracias a esas vacunas de las que se hablará hoy y a la evolución, esperemos positiva, que tenga la pandemia, el año que viene lo podamos celebrar presencialmente en el auditorio del CEM y podamos compartir un rato juntos. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, presidente Blanco. El doctor Bob Joseph Matthew realizará a continuación la presentación Salud y Metrología Legal, la visión de la OIML. Dicha presentación será realizada en inglés. El doctor Matthew es actualmente el segundo vicepresidente del Comité Internacional de Metrología Legal, así como subdirector y jefe de división de Metrología Legal de METAS, el Instituto Federal de Metrología de Suiza, donde recaló en 2016 tras una larga carrera en el sector privado. Es doctor en Legislación Económica Internacional por la Universidad de Berna. Por favor, recuerden enviar sus preguntas a webinar@cem.es. Dr. Bob Joseph Matthew will be presenting our first topic, Health and Legal Metrology, the view of the OIML. Dr. Matthew is nowadays Second Vice President of the International Committee of Legal Metrology, CIML, and Vice Director and Head of the Legal Metrology Division at METAS, the Swiss Federal Institute of Metrology. He reached this position after a long career in the private sector. He holds a PhD in International Economic Law by the University of Bern. Please remember to send your questions to webinar@cem.es. Dr. Matthew, you have the floor.
Good morning. So I will just put on the presentation. So can you see it?
Yeah, we can see it perfectly.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Good. So, estimadas señoras y señores, muchas gracias por invitarme a participar en su webinar. Es un placer y un honor para mí hacer una presentación en nombre de la OIML. Now I will nevertheless switch to English because my Spanish is not good enough to speak in Spanish. Nevertheless, I've just first, before I really deep dive into my presentation, would like also to show my appreciation for the introductory word of Mr. Blanco. And I followed it as far as I could and understand with very much interest. And it's true. I like this expression he used, discreción, invisibilidad of the metrology. And I think this is exactly the point we should make here also, to show today in several aspects that are presented how metrology can provide more value to the overall society and its importance it plays for the society. And this is also the way I a little bit driven and structured my presentation. It's also interesting that he mentioned as well that we are not only talking about health in a specific way, but the health encompasses also food safety, medical safety. It has a social economic impact. And therefore, I will now just start with my presentation, but it was important to me also just to mention that I completely agree with his introductory words, and I think he made a really good statement. So, today I will present on health and legal metrology and the view of the OIML. As already said, First of all, as well from my side, Happy World Metrology Day. This year, the topic is on measurements for health. The World Metrology Day as such is a project which is realized jointly by the BIPM and the OEML. And as by the introductory words already said, it is about to create awareness of the important role measurements plays in health and thus in the well-being of every one of us. And overall, in a wider, broader context, to show that the science of measurement plays a pivotal role in scientific discovery and innovation, industrial manufacturing and international trade, and in improving the quality of life and in protecting the global environment. So, I would like to quickly tell you how I structure the presentation so that you can easily follow and understand why I'm speaking about this or another topic. First, I would like nevertheless to give you more background on what it is, the OEML and its mission. Then I would like to give some insights on the activities that have been made in the area of health by the OEML. And last but not least, I would like to inform you also on the latest initiatives. The OEML, the International Organization of Legal Metrology, is headquartered in Paris. The mission of the OEML is to enable economies to put in place effective legal metrology infrastructure that are mutually compatible and internationally recognized for all areas for which governments take responsibilities, such as those which facilitate trade, establish mutual confidence, and harmonize the level of consumer protection worldwide. So what does that mean in concrete terms? It means, for instance, that we as an organization, the OEML, develop model regulations, standards, and related documents for use by legal authority as industry. This is, in other words, simply said, about achieving harmonizations. We would like, as well, provide mutual recognition systems which reduce trade barriers and costs in a global market, and by doing so, to facilitate trade. We are also representing the interests of the legal metrology community within international organizations and forums concerned with metrology, standardization, testing, certification, and accreditation. We promote and facilitate the exchange of knowledge and competencies within legal metrology communities worldwide, basically building a platform for knowledge transfer and best practices. And this is also very important, and it's also one of the key elements, I guess, also of this webinar, to cooperate with other metrology bodies to raise awareness of the contribution that a sound legal metrology infrastructure can make to a modern economy. The OEML has 61 member states and 64 corresponding members. The two categories have one distinction. Member states are the ones that have ratified the OEML Convention. The corresponding members, on the other hand, are members that have not yet become member due to the fact that they have not ratified the convention as such. Now I would like to go into more concrete examples of the work that has been done and undertaken by the OEML in the area of health. For this, it's important to understand the major fields of activity of the OEML. First, one big area is the technical work. The organization issues several categories of publications. There are international recommendations. They are intended as model regulations for a number of categories of measuring instruments, and which OEML member states are morally obliged to implement as far as possible. There are other categories, international documents, which are informative and intended for guidance purposes. Other publications such as guides, basic publication or expert reports are also part of the technical work. The main aim are definitely to publish relevant international recommendations. This work is done in 18 different technical committees with subcommittees, and this ends up in more or less like 50 project groups. Final goal is really to have a global harmonization of metrological requirements and test procedures. As an example, I can cite the recommendation 149 about non-invasive automated sphygmomanometers, which have been adopted last year. But it is also key to understand that actually regulated measuring instruments are an essential factor for a sound measurement system and for all economies to work together. And this is also another aspect of our work, the OML certification systems, on which I will develop further on the coming slides. But nevertheless, what is important to understand in this context, first of all, is that it is about harmonization of conformity assessment procedure and a mutual recognition of test results. Two other areas which are really important also in every context is the support given to countries and economies with emerging metrology systems, as well as international cooperations and seeking collaboration with other organizations. As I've mentioned, I will deep dive a little bit on the OMLCS. What is it? It is a certification system which strengthens the trust in measuring instruments and measurement results. It enables certification of measuring instruments, avoiding duplicate testing and acceptance of it on an international level. It facilitates international trade measuring instruments, and it makes the work of legal metrology authorities more efficient. You can say once a measuring instrument is certified, it is also accepted everywhere. And this is one of the key aspects of it. We would like to create confidence in test results, and this is essential as well for the health system. But what is the added value for the different stakeholders? If you just take the stakeholders in the area of health, there are several. For instance, doctors, they are users of measuring instruments. They will be happy to see that the measuring instruments comply with requirements, and these requirements have been examined by competent certification bodies, the so-called OML issuing authorities. So this is very much regulated how we can become an issuing authority. Nevertheless, this gives trust in the measuring instruments. But also from another aspect, the patient's aspect, the consumers. They can rely on certified measuring instruments which fulfill internationally agreed requirements and provide a certain level of a standard. But also for those who manufacture, it makes it easier. They can get testing services for their measuring instruments from competent and recognized OML issuing authorities. But also for national authorities which are involved in the health sector, it is a very important system because they can rely on internationally accepted OML certificates without duplicate the testing, and they can issue national or regional type approvals. So it is not also the aspect of confidence, it's not also the aspect of trust, but it's also an aspect which is very important. As Mr. Blanco said, it has also an economic impact overall initiatives that are taken. For the health policy as such, we need also to look at the aspect of costs and overcoming administrative hurdles. And this is in the context of the healthcare policies worldwide very key. And therefore also the OMLCS plays a pivotal role to further foster this. So, what are the benefits of the OML work? Initially, I already mentioned the adoption of recommendations. This is one of the key aspects that I mentioned before. This is the outcome of the technical work, and that's why I was saying technical work is very important. So in terms of related to health aspects, the last year, 2 recommendations were adopted. One on non-automated sphygmomanometers and the other one on automated ones. As well, these two recommendations were then immediately added to the system of the OML certification. And that gives me also brings me to the conclusion. It is just really benefiting. OML is actually developing model regulations, so from the technical work, for use by legal metrology authorities and industries. But also it facilitates through the OMLCS the international acceptance of these measuring instruments. I can say these benefits come definitely from technical work and from the development of the OML certification system. Now I would like to go on to the initiatives in the area of health. It is important that we don't stop with the work just by writing only recommendations. It is also important to provide a platform for discussion, and therefore created a task group on medical devices. Many OML members expressed needs for regulation of medical devices with a measuring function in the context of the pandemic we are going through right now. This task group has been established at the beginning of 2021. It has participants from all continents, and that's very important. Like this, you can move and have aspects from all global corners. Nevertheless, all members definitely recognized that legal metrology requirements are important in the field of medical devices. Speaking about medical devices, we realize quickly there's a vast array of medical devices. We speak about medical weighing instruments, syringes, clinical thermometers, audiometer, computed tomography X-ray equipments, for instance. And this is where then in the discussion we quickly realized there needs to be a focus. But there are also other challenges that have to be overcome. There are regulatory regimes that vary from country to country. Speak about medical devices regulation, for instance, or there are standards. And depending on the country, sometimes the measuring instruments falls under medical devices regulation. Sometimes it's just only regulated to legal metrology requirements. Sometimes there are only standards, but neither regulation on medical devices or legal metrology regulations. There's another challenge. Inconsistencies in post-market legal metrology activities of verification and inspection in many countries. That is not harmonized at all. Every country has its own approach, and the procedures taken are also very, very different. And also, again, I will refer also to the introductory remarks of Mr. Blanco. Digitalization and the use of data play a key aspect nowadays in all the regulation of medical devices. The increased complexity of the measurements and the increased complexity of how they are made put definitely a big challenge. On one hand, you don't want to exclude innovation and want to be too strict. On the other hand, you have to nevertheless be able to control and benefit from these innovations. So there's definitely also a clear need for model recommendation of different types of medical devices with a measuring function. So, what actions have been initiated in this task group? One was that the idea is now to initiate a project to revise the recommendation 115 on clinical electrical thermometers with maximum device, or in this context to develop even a new recommendation to cover infrared thermometers. So there are several people now analyzing this and will come with a proposal very soon. Pulse oximeters, which have become more and more important due to the pandemic, played also a big role in the discussion. There's also the idea of initiating a project on pulse oximeters, which have already today an ISO standard. However, there are no legal metrology requirements defined yet. However, it has to be clear that these instruments that are used by professionals should be only fall under the model regulation, and wearable devices for use by general public is definitely not covered. Last but not least, another, as I initially said, the sphygmomanometers could be more developed in terms of how to cover the verification and inspection, and what kind of details that have to be defined on this topic. So, as a conclusion, OML, as I could hopefully show you, develops model regulations, standards, and related documents in the area of health for use by legal methodology authorities and industry. OML-CS facilitates international acceptance of measuring instruments, such as medical devices. It is important also that we build a platform as an OML to facilitate the exchange of knowledge and competencies within the legal metrology community worldwide, being it through task groups or technical groups. And last but not least, it is always important for the OML, and it is in a position where it should and will cooperate with other organizations to raise awareness of the contribution that a sound legal metrology infrastructure can make in the area of health, like with organizations like the WHO or UNIDO. At the end, the result should be that patients, families, doctors, communities, and policymakers can have confidence in health-related measurements and medicine, and this everywhere in the world. Gracias por su atención. Thank you very much, and buena salud.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Matthew, and thanks also for your perfect Swiss timing. We are even ahead of time. Our next speaker is Robert Velzgos. He will be presenting accurate measurements for patient care, metrological traceability in laboratory medicine. Dr. Velzgos is the Executive Secretary of the Joint Committee for Traceability and Laboratory Medicine, JCTLM, which develops and maintains an international database and the review process for reference materials, methods, and measurement services for in vitro diagnostics. He is also the Executive Secretary for the Consultative Committee for Amount of Substance, Metrology in Chemistry and Biology, CCQM. He is the Director of the Chemistry Department within the BIPM, with programs on the coordination of international comparisons on calibration, including those relevant to laboratory medicines. Please remember to send your questions to webinar@them.es. La siguiente presentación recae a cargo del Dr. Robert Velzgos, quien nos hablará de mediciones precisas para el cuidado del paciente, trazabilidad metrológica en laboratorios médicos. Esta presentación será realizada en inglés. Dr. Velzgos es el secretario ejecutivo del Comité Conjunto para la Trazabilidad y la Medicina de Laboratorio, que desarrolla y mantiene una base de datos internacional y examina el proceso de revisión para materiales de referencia, métodos y servicios de medición para diagnosis in vitro. Es también el secretario ejecutivo del Comité Consultivo sobre Cantidad de Sustancia, Metrología en Química y Biología. Adicionalmente, es el director del Departamento de Química de la Oficina Internacional de Pesos y Medidas, con programas para la coordinación de comparaciones de calibración internacionales, incluidas aquellas relevantes para la medicina de laboratorio. Por favor, recuerden enviar sus preguntas a webinar@cem.es. Dr. Velzgos, you have the floor.
Buenos dias. Good morning. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me today to give a presentation on World Metrology Day, and happy World Metrology Day. So what I'd like to do today is to talk to you about accurate measurement for patient care, and more specifically, metrological traceability in laboratory medicine. So let's start with the question, what is laboratory medicine? Well, first of all, if you're not feeling well, you'll go in to see your physician or your doctor, and you describe your symptoms to him. Doctor will start to think what could be the reason for your not feeling well. It could be related to an infection or potentially a disease such as diabetes or cancer, but potentially heart disease, liver disease, kidney disease, and so on. The medical doctor, will go on to look at your medical history. He may ask to do a physical exam on you. He may ask for some imaging, and he may also ask to take samples to carry out laboratory tests to help him or her diagnose what may be the issue. And it's really this issue of laboratory tests, which is laboratory medicine. So what are the major branches of laboratory medicine? Well, we have chemistry and biochemistry, where the question that we're looking to answer is what is the concentration of a certain species? For example, glucose in blood may be related to a disease such as diabetes. It may be another branch is hematology, where we're looking at the properties of blood. For example, how many blood cells are there? What type are there? What size are they? And are any of them abnormal? Another branch to look at is toxicology. And the question there to be looked at is, what is the concentration of the drug present in the body, and is it at the right level? Too low, and the drug won't be effective. Too high, and there may be toxic effects. Another area of toxicology is actually toxic elements, to see if illness is caused by the presence of a toxic substance within the body. Another area which has been a great concern recently is microbiology and infectious diseases, where the body may be invaded by a microorganism, and there the issue is to find out what is the organism, how many of them are there, and what drug could be used to kill it off. Finally, another series of tests that can be carried out are molecular diagnostics or genetics, where the genetic material of the patient is examined, looking at either mutations to see if that may be the cause of disease or may affect the treatment of disease, or in fact the presence of microorganisms, their identification and their quantification. Finally, another area is surgical pathology or cytology, where a tissue sample may be removed and examined, and very frequently potentially looking for cancer, and if so, what type of cancer is present. So that's the work that's carried out. So what happens when your doctor orders some laboratory tests? Well, the sample is taken from you, it's transported to a lab, a laboratory where the tests are performed, a report is produced and produced back to your doctor, who uses that report to help with your care. And it's that work in the laboratory where metrology really comes in and matters. So we've all probably had samples taken to clinical laboratories. They come in all shapes and sizes. They can be found in hospitals, in the community, and even now sometimes at the bedside. They can perform between tens of thousands of samples measured per day. They're run by trained scientists and pathologists. They use modern scientific equipment. There's an example of one on the top part of this slide. And the aim of these laboratories is to perform useful measurements which can be used in your healthcare. When the results arrive back to the medical doctor, how are they interpreted? Well, they're compared with other information. This information may be a reference interval. These are a series of limits based on what would be expected for a healthy person. It may also be a clinical decision point, which is a value from experts based on clinical studies, or it may simply be a value from a sample previously taken from you as the patient. The important point to remember is there's always a comparison of the result against other values. And what we must make sure is that independent of which laboratory those measurements are made in, we have the same result. And so we must make sure that the results match from other laboratories. And this is really what it means to have accurate results. So how can we achieve accurate results across all laboratories in all different countries in laboratory medicine? And what role does metrology and quality infrastructure play in this? So as I said, if you go to your doctor and a sample is taken, that sample will find its way to a medical laboratory for clinical testing. The instrumentation within that laboratory will be produced by in vitro diagnostic manufacturers. And those in vitro diagnostic manufacturers will need to calibrate their instruments for the chemical biochemical species they're working on with calibrators. Those calibrators would have themselves been value assigned by a calibration, or what's more commonly known as a reference laboratory in this field. And that reference laboratory would have probably used reference materials some of them coming from national metrology institutes, which may also supply those materials directly to IVD manufacturers. An important point to note is that this area is regulated. And one of the regulations that I'll come back to mention, an important one, is that one within the European Union, which is the IVD directive, which was the first one to state clear metrological requirements for calibrators and control materials used in laboratory medicine testing. I'll also talk later on about the Joint Committee for Traceability in Laboratory Medicine, which is a database which contains those methods, materials and services which can be used for traceability requirements. And finally, because this particular regulation is implemented within the European system, the technical requirements themselves are found in harmonized standards. So I'll also talk a little bit about the technical requirements of those harmonized standards for these materials, methods, and services, which are behind the scenes and enable accurate measurements in the laboratories in which your samples will eventually be tested. So the concept of metrological traceability is not new to laboratory medicine. It's well established, and it's based upon the availability of reference methods, reference materials, and reference measurement services. I mentioned the regulatory aspect, and in the late 1990s, a European directive was published, and it had one very important phrase within its essential requirements, and it's this one. The traceability of values assigned to calibrators or control materials must be assured through available reference measurement procedures and/or available reference materials of a higher order. Now, one of the first questions posed when this regulation was published by the IVD manufacturers, which are these materials, methods, and eventually services of a higher order for which we need to be traceable to continue to sell products within the European market. And it's meeting that requirement that the JCTLM, the Joint Committee of Traceability in Laboratory Medicine, was established a few years later. And it was established by the BIPM, the International Bureau of Weights and Measures, representing Measurement Standards and National Metrology Institute, the IFCC, representing professionals in laboratory medicine, and ILAC representing accreditation bodies, and most recently we were joined by ICSH representing professionals in diagnostic hematology. The JCTLM is one of the joint committees maintained by the BIPM, and it is task orientated, and its task here is the structure of the JCTM, and very much I'm going to talk about the database working group, which has established a database of those materials, reference materials, methods, and service that can be used by IVD industry to meet those traceability requirements which appear in regulation. It is an open committee. Those who are interested can join as members, either as national or regional members and stakeholders, and we have experts working within the working group, as I'll show you in a minute, to review nominations of materials, methods, and services. We also have a working group on education and promotion to provide information about metrological traceability and metrological traceable systems to inform the stakeholders, but also medical doctors and others, and all interested parties about the importance of metrological traceability in this area. So the work of determining which methods, services, and materials can be used to underpin diagnostic measurements in the field is carried out by our working group on the database. It's split into various analyte categories, different analyte categories require different expertise, and there are 12 review teams that regularly each year review any nominations of new reference measurement system components that are forwarded to us by all active bodies, including metrology institutes, reference laboratories, and even manufacturers themselves when they establish calibration laboratories within their own operations. So what has the JCTLM delivered? Well, what it's delivered is a database which is quality assured of these higher order reference materials, methods, and services that can be used for establishing metrological traceability. We also have another website which is established for knowledge transfer and promotion and training related to traceability. So the database itself can be consulted via the website of the BIPM. It contains almost 700 entries across 12 analyte groups of over 200 materials, reference materials, 200 methods, and 200 services, which are there and available to be used to establish metrological traceability. I mentioned that what are the criteria for publishing and having those materials, methods, and services accepted within a database? Well, the criteria are set by the harmonized standards, which underpin the directive, which is now regulation, and these are the 4 of these major standards. The first one is 17511, which talks about the general concept of metrological traceability and the requirements establishing it. And then 15193, 15194, and 15195, they look at methods, materials, and reference measurement laboratory services. And those are standards that are developed within the ISO system by ISO 2C212 Working Group 2, working on reference measurement systems. So what I'd like to do in the next part of the presentation is really talk about how metrological traceability has been applied to ensure that we do have accurate measurements for measurands and biomarkers that are important in disease diagnostics and disease therapy. The example that I'd like to choose today is that one of diabetes and diabetes care. Diabetes is a very widespread disease in the world. Over 6% of the world's population, some 420 million people are estimated to have diabetes at the moment. It's a growing number, unfortunately. If we look at its effects, it can be a major cause of blindness, kidney failure, heart attack, stroke, and even lower limb amputation. The numbers are very high in countries. Examples, for example, in US, 34.2 million people have been affected by diabetes. In the UK, the number is something like 4 million, with another million estimated to be suffering from diabetes and yet not diagnosed. And the costs are rather high related to diabetes care. 90% of the diagnoses are related to type 2 diabetes, which is diabetes that occurs when the person can no longer, person's insulin is no longer effective in controlling glucose or can no longer maintain levels of insulin required. From the diagnostics point of view, there are a number of biomarkers that can be measured in the course of diagnosing and following the disease. These include glucose, obviously blood sugar, which is an initial measurement to be made, glycated hemoglobin, which is HbA1c, which is a diagnostic measure used to see the average sugar level in patients over the last 4 to 8 weeks before they were measured, and C-peptide, which is a peptide which is measured to see whether insulin is actually being made in the human body. And what I'd like to do is to choose 2 of those and explain how the metrology system works to ensure accurate measurements for patient care. And I'll choose glucose to start with, and then talk a little bit about C-peptide. Oops. So this is a calibration hierarchy for glucose measurements, and I'll explain it very quickly. So in the system of physical measurements, we can see a very simple calibration hierarchy going from, for example, the international kilogram, as was maintained, moving to national metrology institutes, moving to calibration laboratories, and effectively moving to instrument manufacturers providing kilograms. A similar idea here, but slightly different. So, for example, for glucose, first of all, we have to define the measurand, which is glucose in serum, for example, and then we start with the pure material, which needs to be certified. We move to making a calibration solution which calibrates a reference method usually in this case a mass spectrometry one, which is used to calibrate glucose in serum, and that glucose in serum can be used by the manufacturer then in various steps to multiply the availability of calibrators, which are eventually provided in kits which are used in measurements in the field. This is another diagram showing exactly the same calibration hierarchy, in this case horizontal rather than vertical, but it gives you a better idea of the types of instrumentation that are used across the calibration hierarchy, from those, the ones that are used in metrology institutes and reference laboratory, to manufacturers eventually by users. We can go from, for example, using NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance, to look at the purity of materials, accurate weighing systems to produce calibration solutions, mass spectrometers to develop reference methods for the measurement of glucose in serum, and then onto the manufacturer's system where they can make fit-for-purpose calibrators, which with commutable reference materials, commutable means showing the same properties as human samples, which can then be used for calibration of the end user measurement instrument. So coming back to the standard calibration hierarchy, again, explaining a little bit more, if we look at the activities of the JCTLM, they're very much involved at the top of the calibration hierarchy with the primary calibrators, the secondary calibrators, and the reference methods. In between, we have the IVD manufacturer, and at the end, at the application side, we have the clinical laboratory operating itself normally to ISO 15189 and providing accurate measurements for patient care. So if we look at how the calibration hierarchy has been established for glucose measurements in serum, again, at the top of the calibration hierarchy, what you'd find is a pure material because it's a well-defined analyte. And here, for example, we have an entry in the JCTLM database for a material that comes from the NMI in China, value assigned for the mass fraction of glucose in material using NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance, or mass balance approaches. And we can have confidence in the value that's been assigned to that material because the Metrology Institute has participated in international comparisons. These particular ones are ones run by the BIPM laboratory for the analysis of pure mass fraction in pure materials. And here we see, for example, this is not for glucose, but this is valine, a similarly sized small molecule. And we see the results there of, based upon mostly the application of quantitative NMR, where one can measure the mass fraction of one compound in reference to another compound simply by looking at the proton signals and their quantification. There's a lot of work gone in amongst the National Metrology Institute to produce this sort of measurement capability and apply it to many measurands. So that's the first step in the calibration hierarchy. The second step in calibration hierarchy will be the use of those pure materials to develop calibration solutions and use them in mass spectrometric reference methods to measure lower amounts of glucose within serum. And again, if we look into the JCTLM database, we can see a number of reference methods available developed by different laboratories, which are similar in technique, but slightly different application. And you would see as well that an important point is to show that those different reference methods are actually comparable. Another aspect of the reference method is the method itself has to be used. And a number of laboratories, calibration laboratories, provide reference measurement services where they use those methods to either value assign reference materials or value assign samples, panels of samples that can be used for as calibrators by IVD industry. And again, if we look at the JCTLM database, we can see that a number of laboratories, sometimes NMIs, but sometimes also mostly reference laboratories, provide that calibration service for IVD industry following the methods that are published in the JCTLM database, stating the level of uncertainty with which that service can be provided. Again, we can have confidence in the comparability of those services and the uncertainties and the accuracy which they're provided because those laboratories participate regularly in intercomparisons. In this case, those intercomparisons are organized by the IFCC, the International Federation of Clinical Chemistry RELA scheme, which is maintained within the DGKL German laboratory. And here we can see the results of those reference methods applied to 2 samples of glucose in serum, and hence why you see a box and not a simple line. And you can see rather nicely that all the results agree nicely within the expected uncertainty, which is defined by the green box across the two concentration levels. So again, confidence via comparison with stated measurement uncertainty for well-defined reference methods. And finally, that's not all. We also have secondary reference materials, secondary because of the calibration hierarchy, but these are matrix reference materials. And these are matrix reference materials produced by national metrology institutes that have been value assigned by reference methods. And here for glucose and serum, we can see a particular material that's been available, both to be used as a calibrator for industry, and if it is going to be used for a calibrator, it needs to also fulfill commutability requirements. And commutability is the property of a reference material where it acts as a human sample within the measurement system used by a manufacturer. That's an important issue. And those are available also for use or for validation of calibration hierarchies. And again, we have confidence in the values assigned and the accuracy of the values assigned to those matrix materials because of international comparisons, again run here by the CCQM for clinical analytes in various clinical matrices. You can see that glucose is one of the areas that has been tested by these comparisons, but many others are also being run on a regular basis for clinical analytes. And finally, we come to the clinical laboratory, the medical laboratory that actually carries out measurements on patient samples, and for which we need the accurate results to be compared against interval values to allow an accurate diagnosis. And again, we can see that we have confidence in the measurements these laboratories carry out because we have proficiency testing schemes which these laboratories need to participate in. And here's an example from a German reference system, again 2 samples being used, so we see a Uden plot, and we can see again, you can see the nice blue dots right in the middle there, agreeing with the reference value and within the uncertainty limits, and showing that this whole calibration traceability chain has achieved what it wanted to do in the first place, which is produce accurate and comparable measurements available for patient care. So I'd like to move my second example quickly to a slightly more complicated measurand, and this is C-peptide. And C-peptide comes from proinsulin. So before insulin is active, it's proinsulin. It's then cleaved to produce insulin, which is the biologically active form, and C-peptide remains. And the C-peptide is a peptide made up of 31 amino acids. And why is it interesting to measure? Well, it isn't removed as quickly from the human body as insulin is, and since it's produced in a 1-to-1 molar ratio with insulin, it remains a very good biomarker to measure whether or not the body is producing insulin. So again, it's a well-defined biomarker chemically, so we can apply an SI traceable calibration hierarchy, and this is the calibration hierarchy that's available. And again, starting with the pure material, moving to a reference method, and moving so on down to the actual patient measurement. And again, in this case, the purity analysis, the calibration is slightly more complicated because these are larger molecules and sometimes less pure and require the application of high-resolution mass spectrometry in addition to the other chemical methods. But again, this is something where the NMIs have been working pretty hard on to achieve very comparable results underpinned by comparisons. And we can see that in the case of C-peptide, we have a reference material for the primary calibrator available, in this case from Japan, which can be used in the calibration hierarchy. It's been underpinned by comparisons, again in this case run from the BIPM laboratories, looking at the value assignment of mass spectrum C-peptide in pure C-peptide materials, and together with, as I mentioned, some of the high resolution mass spectrometry work that needs to be looked at for this type of measurand. The primary material can then be used to calibrate reference methods, and if we look in the database, again we have 2 reference methods for C-peptide based on mass spectrometric methods with isotope dilution, but slightly different in the application, one from Japan and one from the United States. And again, when we look at the comparability of those, and it's important to make sure they are comparable, so that if any IVD manufacturer was to use one or other source, they would actually get the same result. We see really very nice comparability between the two. And finally, if we take those methods and apply them to commutable reference materials and allow IVD manufacturers to use them for calibration, what we see is we go from the graph here in the top, where we have quite a lot of spread between different manufacturers, to actually results which are pulled very much closely together, again allowing traceable, accurate measurements, all of which can be compared against the same interval values for patient care, independent of which instrument is used to make the measurement. So again, metrological traceability leading to the expected and wanted result. And finally, those were two examples, but what is the real challenge ahead? Those could be considered as relatively easy analytes to work with, but in reality, in the laboratory medicine field, there are over 700 biomarkers maybe that need to be measured on a regular basis. And the goal and the work of the NMIs and the community in general is working towards reference systems for all of those. And one example, which I don't have time to go into now, but for example, those new biomarkers come up quite quickly. And for SARS-CoV-2, for example, two measurements that are important is one is the copy number from RNA to look at a viral load and presence of SARS-CoV-2. And the second one could be for testing of antibodies, which would look at the immune response. Those are areas which are actively being pursued by the National Metrology Institutes and the measurements community at the moment. So finally, to finish up with, I've given you a brief overview of the Joint Committee for Traceability Medicine and some of the work of the BIPM in this area. If you'd like to find out more, we have a newsletter that's published every year that tells you about new materials, methods, and services that are available each year. And we have the website just for the JCM that looks more at promotion and knowledge transfer material. And finally, since it's World Metrology Day, the JCM has produced a series of short videos looking at various aspects of measurement and metrology in laboratory medicine, and that's available on our website today and for the future if you'd like to look at that. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and again wish you a very happy World Metrology Day. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Viesgoth, and thanks also for your timing. It was extremely perfect. Due to the fact that from now on, all presentations will be delivered in Spanish, we will only present the speakers in Spanish. Like that, we expect to save some minutes and make the seminar smoother. At 1:45, there will be a time for questions and answers, in which speakers may return to speak in English. Con el fin de agilizar el seminario y debido a que las próximas ponencias serán todas ellas en castellano, solo haremos la presentación de los expertos en dicho idioma. La siguiente presentación recae a cargo de Begoña Bravo, quien nos hablará de la determinación del alcohol etílico en muestras biológicas dentro de un ámbito regulado. Begoña Bravo es facultativa del Instituto Nacional de Toxicología y Ciencias Forenses y desde 2010 es jefa de servicio, así como profesora asociada de la Universidad de Alcalá de Henares del grado de Criminalística, Ciencias y Tecnologías Forenses. Lleva trabajando en el área de toxicología forense desde 1995 y ha presentado diversos trabajos en congresos nacionales e internacionales, además de tener publicaciones en toxicología. Participa en grupos de trabajo para el estudio de temas relacionados con alcohol, drogas y medicamentos en la conducción dentro del Consejo de Seguridad Vial y ha realizado tareas de asesoría para la elaboración de protocolos en centros sanitarios para el análisis de muestras biológicas con repercusiones médico-legales. Por favor, recuerden enviar sus preguntas a webinar@cem.es. Begoña Bravo, tiene usted la palabra.
Buenos días. Lo único que no me deja ahora compartir. Ahora sí, perdona. Buenos días. Muchas gracias por la presentación y muchas gracias por contar con nuestro instituto para formar parte de estar aquí en este congreso. Un momento, porque no veo para... Ya, ahora. Muchas gracias. Ahora sí se ve, ¿verdad?
Sí, perfecto, sí, perfecto.
Ah, vale. Pues muchas gracias. Quería, pues... se ve la pantalla completa, ¿verdad? Es que he dejado dos pantallas.
Sí, se ve perfecta.
Vale. Bueno, pues eso, agradecer que ha contado con la institución para estar aquí dentro del seminario sobre metrología y la salud. Y yo les voy a hablar sobre la determinación del alcohol etílico en muestras biológicas dentro de nuestro laboratorio, dentro de un ámbito regulado y con la aplicación dentro de la toxicología forense. No me pasa la pantalla, esto es por tener dos. Un segundo. Ah, sí, vale. El tema a tratar y haber elegido el analito de alcohol etílico se debe a que su determinación es importante porque es la sustancia psicoactiva más consumida en el mundo y esa actividad sobre el sistema nervioso central, esa psicoactividad, hace que tenga un papel muy importante tanto en procesos civiles como en procesos penales, ya que se puede considerar que el consumo tan extendido de alcohol etílico puede incluso suponer un problema de la salud pública. El interés y la necesidad de realizar una medida de manera trazable y con exactitud es porque muchas veces va a estar implicado y la investigación y su cuantificación va a poder permitir establecer de manera jurisdiccional un tipo de delito u otro, aplicar un tipo penal u otro. Es muy importante en cuanto a delitos contra la seguridad vial porque ya el propio legislador ha establecido una tasa a partir de la que considera una concentración, a partir de la que cuando el conductor supera esa tasa, el 1,2 gramos de alcohol etílico en sangre, la persona estaría cometiendo un delito contra la seguridad vial. Entonces, es necesario dotar de sistemas y de que el laboratorio tenga una determinación para poder cuantificar este analito. También el alcohol etílico está presente en muchos casos en donde sospecha de sumisión química, aunque muchas veces se habla de la escopolamina o burundanga, en realidad el alcohol etílico es la sustancia que más frecuentemente nos encontramos en casos de sumisión química y sobre todo en delitos contra la libertad sexual. Es importante, como les decía, establecer la cuantificación y la determinación de esa sustancia, del alcohol etílico, para poder valorar si la persona tenía una vulnerabilidad química y por lo tanto no era viable que hubiera realizado un consentimiento para dicha actividad y en función de eso establecer o no que se ha cometido un delito. Pero no solo a veces es necesario investigar el alcohol etílico en la persona agredida, sino que si se demuestra que el agresor o el sospechoso cometió un delito estando con intoxicación etílica, eso puede suponer un eximente, ya sea total o parcial, de responsabilidad sobre ese delito. Entonces pongo, por ejemplo, pues, en los casos de delitos de violencia de género, en donde muchas veces el alcohol también está presente. Y al ser una sustancia tan consumida, pues está frecuente o puede ser el desencadenante de muchos accidentes, ya sean accidentes de tipo laboral o accidentes de otro tipo, muchos politraumatismos que muchas veces terminan en fallecimientos, en causas, muertes por de etiología accidental. Asimismo, en muertes por incendio se ha visto que es la sustancia que más frecuentemente aparece y que muchas veces puede dar lugar a ese accidente que termina provocando fallecimientos por incendios. Y como les decía, no solo son procesos penales, sino que también es necesario su determinación en jurisdicción civil. Ahí les pongo, por ejemplo, el derecho familiar, cuando hay casos de separaciones y custodias de menores, en casos de que se asuma o se compruebe que hay una drogodependencia, en este caso que estamos hablando sería con respecto al alcohol etílico, pues podría el legislador establecer en cuanto a el tratamiento que haría sobre esas custodias de menores, ¿no? Entonces es importante la determinación del alcohol etílico y la medida de esa concentración, de la concentración de alcohol que haya en la muestra de sangre es la que nos va a indicar el grado de afectación y, por tanto, nos permitirá valorar esa intoxicación etílica del que le hablaba o esa vulnerabilidad por parte de la víctima o la comisión de un delito, como les decía ahí, de seguridad vial. El Instituto Nacional de Toxicología tiene 3 departamentos y una delegación en La Laguna, y toda nuestra actividad pericial, la investigación de este analito y los demás estudios toxicológicos se hacen bajo el paraguas de un sistema de calidad y cumpliendo los requisitos establecidos en la norma ISO 17025. Y como dentro de los ensayos que están acreditados, pues uno es del que estamos hablando hoy aquí, que es la determinación del alcohol etílico en fluidos biológicos por cromatografía de gases con detector de ionización de llama y analizador de espacio en cabeza. Aquí les pongo un poco las imágenes de cómo se trata el análisis. Se realiza mediante analizador espacio en cabeza. Es el primer análisis que se acomete dentro de la sistemática analítica toxicológica del laboratorio, porque al ser un compuesto volátil, entonces se debe realizar, es el primer ensayo que se realiza, intentando manipular lo menos posible la muestra para evitar pérdidas de concentración. Se introduciría en un vial de espacio en cabeza y bueno, pues se calentaría y permitiendo que se alcanzara el equilibrio entre la concentración de alcohol etílico en la disolución y en la fase gaseosa, y esta fase gaseosa se inyectaría en el cromatógrafo de gases, donde se produciría la separación de este compuesto con respecto a otros analitos que pudieran estar presentes en la muestra, y nos permitiría la identificación y cuantificación del analito, en este caso concreto del alcohol etílico. Nuestro rango de cuantificación es de 0,1 a 4 gramos litro y el límite de detección es de 0,04 gramos litro. ¿Vale? Nuestros informes, además, pues informamos de la incertidumbre, sobre todo cuando el dato puede tener una influencia penal. El método acreditado es aplicable no solo a la determinación cuantitativa en muestras de sangre, que es lo que habitualmente se realiza en los delitos o en los análisis de seguridad vial. Es la prueba de contraste, que toda la persona que ha sido sometida a un control de alcohol etílico en carretera mediante un etilómetro, que es una prueba evidencial, cuya regulación se hace a través del Centro Español de Metrología. Cuando la persona solicita una prueba de contraste, esta se hará en la muestra de sangre, porque hay una relación entre el alcohol etílico que hay en el aire alveolar con la concentración en sangre, basado en la ley de Henry, y entonces se haría la determinación cuantitativa en esta muestra de sangre. En función, como les decía, de la tasa obtenida, de la concentración obtenida, podemos estar hablando de una sanción administrativa que estaría recogida en nuestro Reglamento General de Conducción, o superando unos determinados niveles ya lo que se estaría hablando es de un delito, en concreto de un delito contra la seguridad vial. Pero como les decía, no solo el método está acreditado para la determinación de sangre, suero o plasma, que sería lo que habitualmente se emplearía para el análisis en sujetos vivos, sino que muchas veces lo que nos encontramos, o bien porque el accidente termine teniendo una víctima mortal, o porque, como les decía, es una sustancia psicoactiva que está involucrada en muchos fallecimientos y, por tanto, muchas muestras en las que a veces tenemos que analizar son muestras que proceden de la autopsia, son muestras post-mortem, y en estas situaciones a veces la sangre no es viable de poder ser analizada, bien porque no esté presente, porque se haya producido un shock hipovolémico y sea difícil de conseguir, o bien porque se puede haber visto afectada por procesos de putrefacción y, por tanto, posibilidad de generación endógena en la propia muestra de sangre por la presencia de bacterias. Por eso debemos también recurrir, y tenemos acreditado como tal, realizar la determinación en humor vítreo. El humor vítreo es una solución acuosa que tenemos en nuestro interior del globo ocular y que está más protegida de los procesos post-mortem. Por lo tanto, nos permitiría e identificar que se ha tratado de un consumo de alcohol etílico y no de una generación endógena en el caso de muestras putrefactas. Además, el alcohol etílico también existe una correlación de sus niveles el humor vítreo de alcohol etílico con respecto a la sangre, por lo que nos podríamos, en caso de tener solo esta muestra para analizar, podríamos extrapolar la concentración que habría en sangre y, por lo tanto, como les decía, la afectación del sujeto en base a las concentraciones detectadas de alcohol etílico. Además del humor vítreo, pues contamos con otras muestras que a veces son las únicas que hay disponibles a nivel post-mortem. Y en el caso de la toxicología post-mortem, a veces el problema no radica en la cuantificación exacta y veraz fiable del analito, sino en la interpretación, como les decía, de los resultados que se obtienen. Para un poco destacar esa importancia que les decía de la determinación y cuantificación y, por tanto, la medida del alcohol etílico dentro de la metrología legal. Aquí les pongo unos hallazgos de la memoria del Instituto del 2019 sobre los hallazgos toxicológicos en víctimas mortales de accidentes de tráfico. La gráfica que ven es la de los conductores que fallecieron en 2019 y, como ven, el 62% de los conductores dieron positivo a alcohol. Y si nos fijamos en las concentraciones que se detectaron en estos casos positivos a alcohol, en torno al 80% de los casos superaban la tasa que les comentaba, que ya supondría un delito de seguridad vial. Superaban el 1,2 gramos litro. Esto mismo se repite si, en vez de pensar en los accidentes, en los conductores de los accidentes de tráfico, son las víctimas que mueren por atropello, ¿no? En un atropello dentro del contexto del accidente, en donde también el porcentaje es muy similar tanto en los positivos a alcohol como en las concentraciones detectadas en sus muestras biológicas. En concreto, esto es a nivel de la muestra de sangre. Y también les dije que un papel importante jugaba en los casos de sumisión química y, sobre todo, en el ámbito de los delitos contra la libertad e indemnidad sexual. Es importante su identificación por aplicar el artículo 181 del Código Penal, que es el que habla sobre la vulnerabilidad o la nulidad de prestar su consentimiento, ¿no? Entonces, como verán, el alcohol es la sustancia que se detecta con mayor frecuencia. Muchas veces lo que encontramos es un policonsumo, es decir, no aparece solo el alcohol etílico, sino combinado con drogas o con psicofármacos, lo que provoca un sinergismo de acción sobre el sistema nervioso central y justificaría todavía más esa anulación de la voluntad o de la posibilidad de establecer un consentimiento. Si además nos fijamos en los casos que se analizaron ahí en el 2018 que recibimos en nuestro instituto, aquellos que en la toma de muestras se realizó con un tiempo menor a 24 horas y, por lo tanto, aún podría no haberse eliminado el alcohol etílico, casi la mitad de los casos se detectó su presencia. Aquí les pongo unas gráficas porque la muestra que analizamos en el laboratorio es la muestra que se ha recogido cuando la persona ha ido a establecer la denuncia o ha acudido al hospital cuando se ha sentido víctima de esa agresión sexual. En el laboratorio, estos son el número de casos que se detectó y la concentración de alcohol etílico que fue hallada en esas muestras. Pero al legislador lo que le interesa no es el alcohol etílico en el momento de la toma de muestras, sino qué concentración tendría la víctima en el momento de los hechos, porque eso indicaría el grado de afectación. Entonces, teniendo el conocimiento de la tosocinética del alcohol etílico, de su proceso de absorción, distribución y la eliminación, cuando nos encontramos en la fase de eliminación, la curva puede ser una recta y esa pendiente de eliminación se beta es el coeficiente de tilosidación que nos permitiría extrapolar la concentración añadida en el laboratorio con la concentración que habría en el momento de los hechos. Y como verán, las concentraciones, cuando se hace la extrapolación al momento de los hechos, indicarían por encima de ese 1,2 y por lo tanto serían asumibles con esa afectación y con esa vulnerabilidad, ¿no? Que es lo que el legislador necesita para saber si aplica el artículo 181 para establecer jurisdiccionalmente el tipo penal. Y aquí solo indicarles que, como ya les decía, trabajamos, nuestros informes tienen que ser defendidos a nivel de los tribunales y para ellos tienen que demostrar la fiabilidad y la trazabilidad de esos resultados. Y en el caso del alcohol etílico, pues participamos en diferentes ejercicios de intercomparación o de suficiencia, de tal manera que son organizados por distintas entidades. O hay uno que lo organizamos desde el propio instituto para todos los departamentos y para otros laboratorios oficiales que quieren y que participan. Y bueno, tienen distinta periodicidad, lo que hace que podamos a lo largo de todos los meses tener siempre, digamos, un examen y de determinación y cuantificación a veces de alcohol etílico, pero otras veces de otros compuestos volátiles para evitar además y tener comprobado todas las posibles interacciones, y se realizan en sangre, pero como les decía, que el humor vítreo es una matriz que tiene un gran interés a nivel médico-legal, sobre todo en los casos post-mortem, pues también realizamos estos ejercicios de intercomparación en las muestras de humor vítreo. Y bueno, pues esto vuelvo a dar las gracias y es lo que quería transmitirle, así solo un esbozo de la importancia de la investigación de algunos análitos y sus resultados, la obtención de resultados fiables. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Begoña, por su presentación y por mantenerse en el tiempo previsto. De hecho, estamos yendo casi 8 o 7 minutos por delante del tiempo.